David, when you were reading a few minutes ago the quote from the Church of Satan, you you said afterward that Bohr's remark marked a disavowal of realism. And what this made me wonder more generally is what the attitude among physicists, if there was one, going into this debate over the collapse of the wave function, what it was. Like, did physicists have a belief about what they were doing in the scientific endeavor writ broadly that Bohr was repudiating, or was this question of realism new for physics and they were
I
just
think there was,
confronted with it by the phenomena to be explained?
I think there was at least an implicit, I mean, once again, this is a detailed historical question. But I guess my thought has always been that there was at least an implicit idea that people were operating with. That, yeah, what are we trying to do with fundamental physics? Trying to say how the world is. Okay. We're trying to say in a fairly literal, straightforward, flat-footed way how the world is. Okay. And yes, I think what was so, what made there be so much at stake, at least for somebody like me, in the reaction of people like Bohr and the huge majority of the physics community that Bohr carried with him for so much of the 20th century. Um, um, Bohr was, needless to say, there's a long history of philosophical conversations about realism going back as far as one likes. And there are all kinds of philosophical critiques of realism and so on and so forth. What seemed to be astonishing about the way Bohr and Heisenberg and so on were talking was that, yes, there had been this happy, maybe not so deeply philosophically reflective, although in many cases it was deeply philosophically reflective. But anyway, yes, there was a working assumption in physics that what we're trying to do with fundamental physics is find out what the world is like. Okay. And of course, there was this long history of philosophical critiques of realism. What was shocking about the way quantum mechanics was described was that it was the first occasion where, like they, to continue this horror movie theme, the call is coming from inside the house, okay? That certain empirical discoveries had somehow made it clear to people like Bohr who had thought it through that this realistic project had collapsed, okay, could no longer be pursued, okay, represented a deep fundamental mistake or hubris or I don't know what, okay? And yeah, I mean, maybe Tim can comment on this. And of course, there's a lot of more detailed stuff to say about the history of physics before the advent of quantum mechanics. But if somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and wants one sentence, we're scientists, we're physicists who were interested in the most fundamental aspect of physics, pursuing what they would have explained to themselves as a pretty straightforwardly realistic project where what they were trying to do was tell you what the world was really like. Sure, okay. And that's what seemed like it was at stake and at risk and in play in the way people like Bohr and with him much of the physics community for much of the 20th century reacted to quantum mechanics, to the development of quantum mechanics.
So can I just make, I'm not sure, I mean, this is just to try and delineate some problems one might have. If one's worried about this funny question, what are physicists trying to do, or what is physics trying to do? And you're using categories like realism as opposed to, say, instrumentalism. That discussion has been going on forever. It's nothing new about it. Right. So, we go back to Copernicus, and you say, well, Copernicus presents this model, this heliocentric model, and the Earth is spinning on its axis and orbiting and blah, blah, blah. And one way to take that is instrumentally. And that was when Osiander writes the preface to De Revolutionibus to try and keep Copernicus out of trouble with the church, says, I'm not suggesting this is literally what's going on. I'm just saying, if, as it were, fictionally you pretend that this is what's going on, you can then calculate where you'll see Mars and this and that and eclipses in a really efficient way. So you can always take that instrumental attitude, and you can also say, look, right now I'm just interested. This seems to be a good calculational tool. Let me calculate some stuff. And I'm happy doing that. Now, in the case of Copernicus, it's a little bit illustrative that, well, first of all, of course, Copernicus didn't actually take that attitude at all. He thought, no, I'm actually postulating the Earth is spinning on its axis and so on. And of course, once you do that, as Galileo understood, a whole bunch of other questions come in train, like, how do the birds keep up, and why do things fall the way they do? And, if the Earth is literally spinning, all right, now here are a bunch of questions you've got to answer about how the physics of a bunch of other stuff works, given that hypothesis. If you're an instrumentalist, you could just shrug your shoulders and say, I never really thought it was, I was never claiming it was literally spinning anyway. So who cares what the birds do, right? That kind of discussion has been going on. I mean, you could say the same kind of discussion with electromagnetism. Someone might say, well, I've got Maxwell's equations. I can calculate what, a bunch of electromagnetic stuff. And somebody says, yeah, but are there literally electric fields? Are these stresses or strains in a medium? Blah, 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 blah. And you could take two attitudes, right? You could say, well, I don't care. I just think this is good enough instrumentally. Or you could say, I do care, and I'm going to kind of construct a model. So these kinds of, it was not unique to quantum theory that there would be different attitudes. It may have been, Bohr's kind of approach to it might have been a little unique, but it's so obscure, it's a little hard to say. If he was just a committed instrumentalist and said, in general, I'm just an instrumentalist about everything, then you just shrug your shoulders and say, okay. But no, it seemed to be something different, right? He thought it was...
I agree. This is what I mean by the call coming from inside the house, okay? It was always clearly the case that one could take either attitude, okay? And one could have philosophical sorts of debates about what the more correct attitude to take was, okay? It seems to me clear, that Bohr thought something different and unprecedented was going on, okay? That the option of the realistic attitude had somehow evaporated, and paradoxically evaporated under the pressure of empirical discoveries, not of philosophical reflection.
Yeah, just to get us off Bohr for 1 minute, you say when you were doing this is what really interested in you. Yeah. To me, it was actually, I wasn't very interested in Bohr. I was more interested in Wigner. So Wigner's a guy who says, I take these collapses really seriously. Right. And furthermore, if you ask me when they occur, I'm going to say when you make an observation. And when you ask me, when you make an observation, I'm going to mention consciousness. Right. You need a conscious agent to become aware of something. And now you say, oh my God, it's the mind-body problem. Somehow the mind-body problem itself is appearing at the center of physics. That excited me, right? That I thought was very interesting.
What both of our imaginations was this impression of some bigger philosophical issue than you thought you were going to run into in physics being at stake.
Yeah. Right.
I agree. we're not so different. We're not
Right.
so
And the same kind of constructive counterexamples
right.
that Bohr wasn't right also show Wigner wasn't right.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right.
So if this realism instrumentalism dichotomy was not new, is what was new a realism anti-realism dichotomy where the anti-realism consists in something like a repudiation of the existence of underlying determinate physical facts? Is that seem more?
I agree with Tim here. We're putting too much, Bohr. Bohr is not remotely internally coherent enough to sustain an inquiry like this. You got a guy who famously taught his students that a superficial truth is a proposition whose negation is false, and a deep truth is a proposition whose negation is also true. What are you going to do with this guy? Okay. I don't, or that clarity crowds out profundity, or some, I don't know what I'm, there's only so much that the writings of such a person, there's only so much interrogation that the writings of such a person are going to sustain before they completely fall apart.
Right.
But as foggy and confused as all this was, it's what was cited. Not von Neumann, okay? It's Bohr that was cited, okay? And maybe Heisenberg, who thought he was agreeing with Bohr. It's what was cited by most physicists throughout most of the 20th century as what we've learned about the world from quantum mechanics.
Right. And there's yet another quote, which I don't have to hand, I wish I did, to this point, which was a quote from De Broglie. I saw it recently. I don't know if it was in a letter or something. I think it was in a letter. And De Broglie is saying about the historical situation, he says, some people are leaders, right? Some scientists are not just scientists, but they're organizers, right? They're leaders of movements. And Bohr was like that.
Right.
And Bohr organized with Heisenberg, even though they had internal disagreements, and created a common front and so on. And De Broglie says, I was kind of a loner. Schrodinger was kind of a loner. Einstein was kind of a loner. None of us liked what Bohr was doing, but none of us was a leader. None of us was trying to create a school.
Right.
So we were just off on our own, kind of, scattered stochastic terrorists, if you will. This, resistance was all scattered and disorganized.
Right.
The reason the Copenhagen people had such a profound influence just had to do with organization.
Right.
And I think historically that's correct. I think that's actually historically accurate because, you think of the names against it. Einstein, Schrodinger, De Broglie. These are not like fringe characters,
right?
Sniping from the outside, but they were pushed aside. And there's not really an intellectual account of that. There's a kind of political account of that.
Yeah, sociological. Yeah, I agree.